Hi, my name is Necia StanfordBillinghurst, and I am sharing this presentation from Adelaide, South Australia, where I'm a PhD candidate at the University of South Australia. And my presentation today is titled We Wear the Mask, Agentive and Strategic Language Play in Southern and Northern Spaces of Risk. Now, the inspiration for the first part of this title comes not from the current global pandemic, but rather from an 1896 poem by Paul Laurence Dunbar, an African-American poet, describing the metaphorical mask of happiness that African Americans were expected to wear in post-Civil War America, despite struggling under continued racism and segregation. The mask metaphor has been embraced by later scholars such as Frantz Fanon, Ansel Strauss, and many others. Masking can be used to protect against viruses and other things, and or to project an identity. And in everyday life, we all use aspects of masking through screen names, Twitter handles, or gaming avatars. In my current research, I'm exploring the phenomena of Southern multilingualisms, and the idea of masking has also emerged. I've been working with a cohort of 31 women originating from countries in the global south to research everyday language practices with Southern multilinguals. And my methodology is social constructivist grounded theory with Southern epistemology and reflexive practice. Now, the women have participated in a language survey and follow-up interviews, and in their responses, several of the women have shared small stories in which they portray themselves as agentively and strategically playing at the intersection of language and appearance in order to mask their identities in both Southern and Northern spaces. Now, in this abbreviated presentation, I examined several short stories of masking as shared by 3 women of South Sudanese heritage resettled in South Australia between 1998 and 2012. 2 of the experiences are from their time as refugees in Kenya, while the third occurs in Australia. And each of the stories emerged based on a prompt question asking if there was ever a time when their languages were an advantage or helped them. Now, in the first story, the woman shares an experience taking the bus on one of her limited excursions outside the refugee camp. I refer to this as a South-South interaction, signaling that the woman is an individual from the global South, engaging in a context where the global South is also the center of power. She explains how the local Kenyan population capitalizes on the refugees' outsider status to extract additional money when they're taking public transport. The police use appearance and language to identify who's Kenyan. Now, because she looks Kenyan, she can pass if she doesn't need to talk. However, she doesn't know Swahili, only Dinka and English. And those languages, without using Swahili, identify her as non-Kenyan. She stresses that there's a shared assumption that speaking Swahili equates to being Kenyan. And she also shares how Dinka and English, which are 2 powerful languages in other contexts, are not useful in this situation, where Swahili is the language of power. In this next example, example 1b, the next woman tells a similar story, and she also appears Kenyan, but she has this added advantage of having learned Swahili in the refugee camp, so she can project this full Kenyan identity through both appearance and language. This is another illustration of that assumption that language corresponds to nationality. Now, this woman carefully plays with her appearance and her language in order to create an identity in this risky situation, which she says could result in bodily harm, for example, rape. In her story, she reveals an understanding of language as both communicative and symbolic. She knows that she can draw on the symbolic power of Swahili as representing Kenyan identity. And she also plays into beliefs that these separate languages exist. In fact, she relies on both the symbolic power of language and nationality and separate languages in order to pass in this risky situation. Her comment that getting out of the situation was huge reveals both her recognition of the risk of her actions, as well as her awareness and the self-portrayal of herself as a resourceful and a strategic multilingual. From these two examples, we can make the following observations. First, the interactions are situations of mobility in context of asymmetric power. The women make purposeful use of appearance and language to shift the balance of power by protecting and by projecting identities. Second, both the women understand that languages are social constructs existing in dynamic relationships with each other, with different languages exerting more power at different times. So more than merely recognizing that language is both communicative and symbolic, they actually rely on the symbolism to establish identities which enable them to navigate precarious situations. So now let's look at the final example. And here, I refer to this as a south-north interaction. This is a southern speaker who's based in the northern space of Adelaide. And she's on the phone. She's calling Centrelink, Australian Social Services. And here she explains how she uses the phone line established for multilingual speakers to get through the system more quickly. She clearly indicates that she's being strategic in her actions because she knows that asking for a translator is going to get her quicker service. She laughs when she's telling the story, and she proudly asserts that she uses it all the time to her advantage. So here, this woman reveals how playing into a stereotype of a non-English speaker and using Dinka language is actually more powerful, more resourceful, because it moves her to the head of the queue. On the phone, unseen, unknown, she's able to assume an identity that is more useful in this space. Paradoxically, in the Australian northern space, using her southern language is her best advantage. Now, the fact that A uses an interpreter for the service shows ingenuity as well as irony, since she actually works as an interpreter for the South Sudanese who don't speak English. In fact, in her very next sentence, she comments that working as a Dinka translator is a second advantage stemming from her linguistic repertoire. Now, in sum, these small stories illustrate how linguistic resources combined with appearances are used by Southern multilinguals to create masks that protect and project identities in both Southern and Northern spaces. Returning to the observations, we see that the women are interacting in situations where there's an unequal balance of power. They recognize that languages are social constructs existing in dynamic relationships with each other. And comprehending that this symbolic power of language swings in different contexts, the women use their multilingual repertoires to shift the balance of power to their advantage by calling upon different languages and identities. Moreover, they rely on the recognition of separate, discrete languages, that ideologies are linked to linking language to citizenship and nation, and the symbolic power attributed to individual languages. And they do this to craft their identities in situations of risk. This is particularly interesting because in Southern-centered research on multilingualisms, equating language and nationality is discredited. In addition, there are debates going on whether Southern multilinguals view languages as separate entities, or if language isn't just more of a fluid construct. So I argue that these data shared by the women suggest two key conclusions that merit further research. And first, it's this idea that Southern multilinguals may use this notion of separate, discrete languages equating to national belonging as a way of taking back agency in situations of asymmetric power. And second, that language constructs, often regarded as oppressive, can, in actuality, both oppress and enable the oppressed to liberate themselves. I look forward to delving deeper into this research and further exploring this idea. For those interested, I have 3 publications that are forthcoming that talk about these ideas and share more data. Thank you for listening to my presentation. I appreciate your comments and your feedback.